Hi, everyone. Thanks for watching. Well, this morning, Paul McCartney called up Howard Stern on his radio show and touched base with him, talking a little bit about the Beatles, talking about how he's doing in these crazy times with the coronavirus, and a few other things. I didn't get to hear it live when it first aired. What I did was I played a playback of it, which I actually found on YouTube. Don't know if it's still there, but that's where I heard it. I took some notes and just thought I would fill people in and give you a recap of kind of what was covered. Okay. Well, to start with, Paul said that he was calling Howard from Sussex, England, because that's where he is now with the lockdown. And it's funny, it kind of started out with typical Howard Stern humor, and Paul was ready for it before Howard even started. Howard said something to the effect of, when I interview you, I feel like I'm interviewing somebody like Beethoven and Mozart, and I feel like I have to ask you everything, I have to do that. And then Paul said right off the bat, yeah, but would you ask Mozart or Beethoven if they got laid? Which I thought was like a good sense of humor right from the start, knowing where Howard's act is. And then he went on to say that although Paul, is in Sussex, his wife Nancy is in New York, so they're actually stuck being apart and separated right now because of this. And then Howard joked around, well, so that answers that question about, anyway, that was a start. Then Paul said how with this pandemic, he's never seen anything like this, just like we haven't either, even though through the many years, we've had all of the kinds of various types of crisis, but never anything that affects the whole world kind of together at the same time in such a way that this does. And I agree with that. This is really unique. And then, of course, Paul went on to say things which are starting to get printed right now, I noticed everywhere, about the Chinese government, and talking about how he hopes that they get super hygienic about these wet markets because, quote, it's a little medieval eating bats, unquote. I agree with that too. Paul, of course, is against eating animals, period, or any kind of life like that. But you have to agree, if I could throw my own 2 cents about that. And then Paul went on to say, quote, they might as well be letting off atomic bombs because it affects the entire world, what they're doing. And he said he understood their problem is going to be something like, well, people have been doing this like forever, and this is just what they do. And then Paul said, well, they did slavery forever too, and, until they didn't, and, you've got to change things at some point. That's what Paul said. Howard Stern said he feels sorry for the younger people today, and then kind of said, like, imagine how the Beatles would have been had they had this coronavirus or something like this when they were just starting out trying to be famous in Hamburg or something, and that the Beatles never would have existed, which is kind of an interesting point. And I've been thinking that myself too. It's just crazy. It's I've had my young days. I feel sorry for the real young people who haven't really enjoyed their real young life yet. And then Paul had to explain how it was necessary for him to postpone a bunch of concerts, and including the Glastonbury Festival. He was going to be playing that this year, he said, and he said Paul was very disappointed for himself, but even more especially disappointed because the fans who bought the tickets are missing out, and they were looking for something to have fun to do and everything, and they're going to be out of luck. So he felt bad for the fans. And then Howard brought up about recently, in last year or so, something like that, where Ringo joined Paul on stage at Dodger Stadium to play Helter Skelter. And of course, then Howard goes into these silly questions like, hey, did Ringo ever ask you, Paul, at the end of the show, hey, man, that was so great, do you think maybe I could join your band or something? Did Ringo ever ask you that? Anyway, and Paul jokingly said back, no, it's not like that, but he says, maybe I'll join the All-Stars with Ringo, which was kind of a funny joke. Just reading from notes here, folks. And then they got into an interesting discussion, I thought, again, about how Howard said, it seems like you used to underestimate George Harrison, as a songwriter, and what do you think? And Paul, owned up to it, and Paul said, he admitted, yeah, in the beginning, as we all knew, he kind of underestimated George because he didn't seem that interested in writing songs at first. And Paul said, quote, it was easy to underestimate him at first, because of that. Because John and Paul wrote all the music. George wasn't that interested, and then later on he really bloomed. Quote, that's the word he used. Later on, he wrote, quote, some of the greatest songs ever, and went on to say like how inspirational and important "Here Comes the Sun" is, especially in today's climate with the virus we're dealing with. Howard went on to talk about how, if you were on a desert island, he asked somebody, I forget who it was, whether it was Jimmy Kimmel or somebody, I don't remember exactly who, would you, if you had to pick one band like the Rolling Stones or the Beatles to have on a desert island, who would you pick? And he said he came up with the right answer, which is the Beatles, and Howard agreed. Howard said, yeah. And Paul went on to talk about the friendship between the Beatles and the Stones, and how, a lot of these things were exaggerated. They went on talking about how supposedly, the Stones always seemed to copy everything the Beatles did after they did it. And Paul said, well, it kind of became a little joke between us. We could notice they were doing that. And Paul insisted, how much he enjoys the Rolling Stones. They're friends. And he says, I love the Stones, but I agree with you. The Beatles are better, he said to Howard, which is funny. And then Howard mentioned the Beatles movies, Hard Day's Night and Help, and asked, if Paul was ever asked to be a leading man. Now, of course, a lot of us know these answers, these things already. Paul is being interviewed by Howard Stern. Howard has the opportunity to ask him all this, and it's like, I knew the answer to that, But anyway, Paul went on to tell the story about how, yes, in fact, the Italian director Zeffirelli offered him the leading role in Romeo and Juliet, and Paul was very flattered, but decided he said, I had to politely decline. He said, because he said, I just couldn't do that. He said, you need an actor. He said, for something like Romeo and Juliet, he says, and he said, I could never do that. So Paul said he knew his limits in that regard. Let's see. Howard Stern talked a lot about how John and Paul always wrote these great songs, they'd be in a room or something. And the way Howard said, you guys could go in and write a song in like 20 minutes. That's amazing. And then Paul said, well, it wasn't 20 minutes. It was more like 2 to 3 hours. And then Paul went on to say how the amazing thing was that they wrote something like 300 songs, Paul said, together. And every time they went in together, they would edit each other's songs, help each other out. But the main thing is, incredibly, they never had a dry session. They'd always wind up, as we know, coming out with stuff. Something would always come from these sessions. It wouldn't, it never came up empty, which is kind of amazing, all the time together. Then Howard insisted that John almost vetoed the song Let It Be. He said, John didn't like that song. And he said he didn't really like it. And he said he didn't like Mother Mary. It was too religious and everything. And luckily, Paul denied that kind of and said, no, he didn't mind Let It Be, and this and that. And said, I don't know, at least that's what Paul's side of it is. So I love all this. Like, I have to throw this in. All this, like, let's get John, let's bash John, because John's the one who's gone and Paul's the one who's here. So the man can't defend himself. So keep on bringing up stuff. We'll get to that a little bit. I guess I'll get to it now. I'm going to go out of sequence here because eventually they talked about the song How Do You Sleep? And Howard's like, John called you out in that song, man. And John said the only thing you'd done was yesterday. I mean, that's crazy. He couldn't believe that. Why would he say that? And of course, Paul rightly said, of course I did a lot more. He says, I could have said, what about Eleanor Rigby? What about whatever, Long and Winding Road? What about all these songs? He says, but, he said, I had to take a few punches. He says, that was kind of John and this and that, but we, how later on in later years we talked about that kind of stuff, and that was all forgotten. But I couldn't help thinking to myself during that whole conversation, while we're busy caving in on John and rattling him over the head about that, neither one of them, neither Howard nor Paul, thought to mention, well, that was John reacting to being hurt by something Paul already said on his album Ram, and most notably, Too Many People, the song that Paul himself in recent times has admitted was a knock at John. So funny how they, Paul didn't think to say, well, that was John's response to me taking a shot at him on Ram. But okay, now the reason I did this a little out of order was I want to end on a happier note. he did say in the movie, the new movie, Peter Jackson movie, he mentioned that. He said in the new movie coming out, you can see that John is really, and not many people know, Paul says, that John was really had a warm, loving side. Called him, he said he was really, seriously a beautiful guy. We all loved him. And people are going to see that in the movie, the Peter Jackson movie. And I'm thinking, weren't we able to see that many times before in other films, other interviews? Granted, John could be really malicious, such as in the Rolling Stone interview of 1970, but this play, the wonderful, loving side of John is there to hear in other things he's said over the years in interviews, and also in a lot of his music. It's not a big mystery that there was that good side to him, too. So let's talk a little about the Get Back movie, the Let It Be project. Paul was really excited about it. He mentioned the Peter Jackson thing, and Howard asked him at one point, well, when is that coming out? And Paul wisely said, well, when is anything coming out anymore? He says, it'll come out, but, with what's going on now, who knows, that kind of thing. And Paul called the new Peter Jackson Get Back, quote, bloody great. He said, the film shows that our respect for each other, and he's, having fun, and it's a much nicer and more friendly feeling than the story that came to be, he says. He said it's a joy to see it unfold. And then he said in the movie, you could see things like us working on the words for Get Back, and John's working on songs, John's even helping George work on words for his song, George's songs. And he goes, it's going to be great. He says, you wait. He says, so he really is very hopeful about this and excited. It's funny because the thing goes on for about 46 minutes or something like that before Paul finally says, well, I have to go now. And he kind of was going to go. And Howard says that, he felt like he was cutting Howard off. And Robin, his sidekick, Robin, the female Ed McMahon, said something about, well, is it something important you have to do, Paul? And Paul says, I have to change the bed. He said, these days you have to do it all yourself, what's going on. But then they revealed, Howard and Robin said at the end of the interview, Paul was very nice because originally there was only supposed to be, I think, maybe like 30 minutes with Paul, and Paul stayed on for longer, like almost 20 more minutes. So he stayed on a lot longer. And Paul left by saying regarding the coronavirus epidemic, he said, quote, the clouds will roll away. So, he gave a little bit of hope about that. So, it was actually more entertaining. A lot of times when I've seen Paul on with Howard Stern, Howard's a fan of the Beatles, and he's always very eager to ask these questions, a lot of which we've heard a million times before, but this was interesting. One thing that I was kind of surprised about was Paul either forgot or neglected to mention that this Saturday coming, April 18th, is going to be on a show where they're going to be doing performances, I guess, live, virtual performances from home, and Paul is going to be on this special. So it's April 18th. I'm just a little surprised that wasn't mentioned. Anyway, there it is, a real quick, it went on for a little longer than I thought, though, quick recap of what they discussed. And if you can find the show and you want to listen to it, by all means, be my guest. Thanks, everybody.